Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a quick minute to let you know that this podcast is brought to you, of course, by Kobold Press. If your 5th edition adventures take you deep into the dark woods, you'll want to check out the 5th edition Margrave Player's Guide from Kobold Press. The Old Margrave is an ancient wood filled with magic, treasure, and dangers. This book gives you everything you need to journey into the Margrave, or the forests of your favorite campaign setting. That's right, you can use it with anything. You don't have to use it with the Old Margrave if you don't want to. Any forest, boom, throw this down, because you get 3 new playable races and forest-themed class options for barbarians, clerics, druids, rangers, rogues, warlocks, and wizards. That is pretty awesome. Some unexpected classes there, so I'm excited to promote this because, come on, obviously rangers and druids, of course, but warlocks, wizards, rogues, come on, that's good stuff. You'll also find 13 new companion beasts, 6 new feats, and 45 new spells. All of it play-tested, all of it amazing, all of it from Kobold Press, some of the greatest game designers in the world, people, in the world. New magic items include the Bracelet of the Fire Tender, Circlet of Holly, and Sickle of Thorns. Look for the Margrave Player's Guide for 5th edition at your local game store or buy it online at koboldpress.com. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. On the show, we are talking with the one and only Sersa Victory about traps. Sersa is a master crafter of traps and death trap dungeons and has put out a free system-neutral supplement about traps that we are going to talk about. This was a great conversation. He's just brilliant. We talk about story. We talk about all kinds of different traps that can challenge your players, and it is awesome. So here is my interview with him. All right, everybody, now I am here with one of my favorite designers in the world, one of my favorite people. Sersa, welcome back to Tabletop Babble. For people who don't know, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
Well, thanks for having me back. It's always such a fun time to come on the show. So my name is Sersa Victory. I am a independent game designer that specializes in death trap dungeons for tabletop and video games. My most recent works include Tomb of Mercy. Kobold Press put that out. I have another one with Kobold Press coming soonish called Necropolis of the Mailed Fist. That should be coming here really soon. I'm excited about that. And then, of course, my most recent work, Testament of Malice, which is a free book of traps that I self-published.
Yes, absolutely. And people should definitely check it out. We've got a direct link on our website to Testament of Malice, and we'll also have it to all the other products we're talking about, Tomb of Mercy and that sort of thing. And you'll have to come back on when your next product comes out so that we can talk more about it. Because I think whenever we come on to talk about this stuff, you help change the perception a little bit about how difficult these things are to make, to run, to get sort of the fun and the buy-in of, which is a big part. And one of like the number one questions, I tweeted out a little while ago, hey, we're going to do this podcast. One of a big question that kept coming up was like, how do I make traps make sense? Like, how do I make traps make sense in the story? Why would they be there? Why would they yada yada? And I feel like you've been on enough. I know what you're going to say, and I agree with it. But I want to hear you say it again. So how do we make traps make sense? Does it even matter?
You don't have to. So that's my usual answer. Is it's 100% okay if you are doing abstract dungeon design where the traps are there because we're all sitting down to play a dungeon delving game to steal treasure and kill monsters and dodge traps. I know that's what we're here for. You know that's what we're here for. So let's not pretend. That being said, I think there are ways to leverage the theme of your dungeon adventure to come up with interesting traps. And there are, I think, ways that you can place traps that feel a little bit more natural. So in Testament of Malice, I talk about sort of 3 places where I feel like traps are best placed. And the first one of those is as an ongoing hazard in a battle or an encounter, right? So not every trap has to be sort of a one-shot thing. It doesn't have to be a hidden thing. It can be something where the second that you walk into an encounter area, it's playing a supporting role next to monsters, other traps, hazards, and puzzles, right? So in the parlance of the book, I call them blaster traps. So you go into a room, it's a tomb, you're fighting skeletons, that's well and good, but there's also some sort of bone dust that's filling the room, or there's some sort of like a dart swarm that is blocking off a choke point, right? The second way that I usually place traps is as a one-shot twist in a battle. Mm-hmm. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a way at some pivotal, critical, dramatic moment in a battle, you unleash a trap that forces the players to reassess sort of their tactics thus far. And, it's another instance where you can look to the theme of your adventure. Like, okay, what are some things that can go sideways in the middle of a battle in a tomb, right? It could be a player accidentally triggers some cursed glyphs, or one level of the necropolis falls into the other and busts open sarcophagi. There may be some sarcophagi that are themselves trapped, try to suck you in. There's a lot of ways that you can link it up to the theme of your adventure where it feels a little bit less unnatural, if that makes any sense. And then the last place where I usually place traps are, I call them Punisher traps, and they are there to punish the incorrect solving of a puzzle, right? And I think that's the most thematic one, I think, because players, even if these traps are hidden, they will always suspect them, right? You walk into the tomb, there's a pedestal, there's a crystal skull on the pedestal, there are strange murals on the walls. Like, if you lay a finger on that crystal skull, something's going to go weird, right? It's going to get pretty dicey. So again, I think those are three ways where, you can place traps that don't feel, I hate the word arbitrary, right? Mm-hmm. But that feel like they are part of the environment, right? They are either hazards in the environment that support, other threats in a battle. They are twists. The dungeon itself is sort of changing at a dramatic moment to complicate the player's tactics, or they are sort of the ominous backdrop to a major puzzle or a major sort of intellectual or even a role-playing challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, and I think you're right, and a lot of the products you've put out, like Tomb of Mercy, right, have a story to them, right? There's, in Tomb of Mercy, there's a story goal the players are trying to accomplish. There's a reason that there are traps in this dungeon, and, you've got to make your way through each of them to get to that end goal. And I think there is, like, a lot of fun to be had with traps. I always think of the opening scene, right, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones is going through that temple, and it's like trap after trap after trap that he is triggering or figuring out how to get by or that sort of thing. They just seem to make such sense narratively in my mind a lot. And it's, the monsters that are there, they just know how to avoid the trap if there's a monster there, right? Or it doesn't trigger because the monster's undead and undead can't trigger the trap, but everything else can, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, I will say, and this is something that I'm going to experiment with hopefully more in the future, are what happens if the monsters aren't immune, right? So one of the, I think, more interesting ways that traps can be used, oftentimes they're considered as sort of this one way, like this is something that has been placed in the dungeon to make the players' lives more difficult. Right. But I think there's a lot of opportunities to look at a trap that you place in a dungeon and say, what are some circumstances where I can use the trap as treasure, as a reward, where I can reward smart or lucky or brave players with the ability to leverage that trap against their enemies, right? And this can be especially true in a dungeon whose builders are not its current inhabitants, right? Mm-hmm. Because, the current inhabitants, the monsters the players are fighting, they're just as alien to the dungeon as the heroes are. And if you can set up choke points are a great way to do this, where if I can, if I know there's a monster in the dungeon that, can't see very well, but it can smell blood. Okay, well, if I'm a smart, enterprising player, I'll just draw a little blood on my hand and try to lure the monster into the choke point so it gets hit by the darts or falls into the pit or those sorts of things. I actually had a really amazing moment in a campaign I ran last year where I used one of the traps from Testament of Malice, which is this sort of like an Atlas statue, and it's carrying a monstrous glass sphere on its back that's just filled with churning magma.
Oh.
And they knew, because it did sort of the little intro to every scene in Saw where they see the giant statue and they see the sphere and they trace sort of like, okay, well, we know for a fact that this thing's going to throw the sphere. So they follow the path and, oh, it looks like there's a door, like perfectly lined up across the way. So what happened was we're playing along. It's, a couple rounds of battle. It's been going good. And the wizard had some power where, as a reaction, it could cancel an attack made against himself, and then teleport that monster somewhere. So I remember I rolled up. I had this big, large monster, and it makes this heavy swing on this frail wizard. And he goes, I'm going to use my reaction, but I have a question for you. Does this spell preserve the creature's momentum? And I'm like, sure. Because usually it's like say yes to the players, do whatever sounds cool. So I'm like, hell yeah, that sounds great. Why? So he goes, I'm going to teleport it out of my way, facing the glass sphere. And so it followed through and it punched into the sphere, busted open this 10,000 gallons of magma. And the trap was when the glass would shatter, all the magma would harden immediately. And by design, it would harden over the door. And thus you couldn't get in it. But because the player was smart and thinking about the environment, they managed to trap this elite monster and bypass this really difficult fight. So I've been thinking a lot about traps don't just have to be something that you use to make the players' lives harder, but, think about ways that the players can take advantage of traps and leverage them to their advantage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, and I think that's another sort of cinematic thing that we see a lot in movies and television and that sort of thing. Poor Alfred Molina in the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark, he falls a victim to a trap after he steals the idol from Indy. This is big spoilers for Raiders of the Lost Ark. You haven't seen that 30-year-old movie. But yeah, there's all kinds of fun stuff, I think, that can happen with traps, which is one of the reasons they're so great to include in games, which sort of brings me to the very beginning, which is if people out there have never designed a trap, right, who are listening, where do you recommend they start? How do you recommend you start with an interesting, cool trap?
Yeah, so I think it starts first and foremost with the theme, right? So one of the things that I do is before I design any kind of traps, I will sit down and go, what are the sort of the raw materials that my theme gives me? So I think, okay, well, I'm in a tomb, so that's an easy example. So what do I have to work with? I have bones, and I have curses, and I have dust, and I have sarcophagi, and I have urns, and I have treasure. And in a lot of cases, I'll just sit down and write those on a note card and say, what are my raw materials? Again, trying to sort of link it to the theme of the adventure, of the dungeon. And then what I do, and this is so absolutely crucial, and this is what in my mind separates a good trap from a boring trap, is what is the hard choice, or what is the interaction that this trap is going to invite the players to participate in? Because nothing makes me more upset than seeing a trap in a published adventure where there's a really cool theme and there's a really cool build-up, and then the trap fires if the players walk into a specific square, and then they make a saving throw, and if they fail that save, they take 1d8 strength damage.
Right.
And that's it. And that, in my mind, is not only is it a tremendous missed opportunity, but I think, 40 years of that have given, I don't blame people who don't really like traps or don't know how to use them very well, because there's really not good examples of how to do that. Most traps are kind of like that. So what I do, and this is what I set out to do in Testament of Malice, is every single trap is made up of a combination of what I'm calling kind of like the fundamental hard choices or the fundamental interactions in a death trap dungeon adventure. So one of them could be present them with a risk versus reward choice. and then combine that with a fundamental challenge type to something like worsen a danger further in the dungeon, right?
Right.
So, and that's how every single trap in Testament of Malice was made. And what happens is I typically just make that effect as a rider on the trap's effect, right? So it's never just the dart hits you and it does 1d6 damage and you just kind of move on with that attrition marked off. It's okay, so this trap is going to hit them. The dart hits them, and now suddenly this hero must make a risk versus reward choice. And depending on the choice they make, that will worsen a danger further into the dungeon.
Oh.
So then, yeah, and then so from there, that's when you bring sort of your theme back in. And so to kind of summarize it, because I sort of wandered there for a second. For me, it's always start with the interaction, and that can be a hard choice. It can be a challenge type, and I can talk more about those if you want. It could also be a role playing opportunity. There aren't a lot of like role playing focused traps in Testament of Malice, but there are some. And a favorite of mine, which seems to be a favorite of a lot of the people who read it, is this trap where it's a spawner, it's a summoner trap. So it's one of those traps where every single turn, kind of like the old Gauntlet arcade games, like there's some sort of feature in the area that just keeps spitting out minions every single turn. Disable it. So the hook, though, is one of the characters recognizes the heraldry in this tangle of skeletons. Like, oh, those are my ancestors. And so the explicit choice that's presented in the book is you can go because there's a matriarch, like a sitting atop this pile of bones from which all of these skeletal warriors are flooding forth. And you can identify yourself like, hey, I am a descendant and I want to take command of all these skeletons.
Wow.
And so in the book, it says, okay, have that player stand up and then recite, going back 6 generations, their maternal lineage. So it's like, I am Glizia, the daughter of, Gausia, the mother in gray, daughter of, and just goes kind of back like 6 generations. There's no, there's no mechanical, like there's no right or wrong way to do it, but it's just an opportunity for a character to sort of role play. So even sort of role playing moments can be attached to the effect of a trap.
I feel like so much of traps can be, where specifically are you, interacting with this trap? Which piece of it are you interacting if it's like a big mechanical trap or something like that? And roleplay is just another way of interacting with things. You had mentioned that there are different types of traps.
So a couple years ago, I put out a little free ebook called Fortune Teller's Guide to Death Trap Dungeon Design,
nice.
Where I laid out 22 what I thought were sort of the fundamental challenge types in a Death Trap Dungeon adventure. So you have things like the hard choice. You have like unleash danger further in the dungeon, indirectly quiz the players on their knowledge of the dungeon. Actually, a really good analog would be the GM moves in Dungeon World. There's a lot of overlap there, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So if you're not familiar with Dungeon World, there's a whole list. I think there's probably, 24 moves that the game master can make in response to the players screwing something up, right? And that put them in a spot or turn one of their powers back on them or, reveal an immediate danger, stuff like that. Things that aren't just you deal damage, but it's like you are inviting the players to participate in the game and to have some kind of interesting interaction. And that can be a tactical interaction. That can be, a hard choice. It can be a role-playing interaction, but just something beyond, just rolling a saving throw and taking damage. And the thing that really changed my mindset on this was, I think in our sort of gaming culture, we draw a pretty hard line between stuff like traps and things like monsters. Even in response to the tweets that you make, like, hey, any questions about traps? I mean, I was not surprised to see things like, are traps even relevant anymore to the game? But you will never, ever, ever, well, maybe not never, ever, but hear someone say, are monsters still relevant in D&D?
Right. Yeah, that's definitely true.
And a big part of that is the way that they're sort of framed in the rule books and things like that. But the thing that really kind of changed my thinking about this was that traps are no different from monsters. They're no different from curses or diseases or hazards. All of these things are vectors for presenting the players with difficult choices and opportunities to role play, if that's something that you want to do as well. So I had the privilege of being one of the instructors in the RPG Writer Workshop, which is run by Ashley Warren, who just put out Uncaged, which is the book is gorgeous, unbelievable.
Taking the world by storm too. It is an incredible book that is worth every one of its many sales that it's getting right now. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, it's truly unbelievable. But yeah, she was nice enough to let me be one of the instructors, and that was the thrust of the lesson that I did, which was that every single thing, every danger that you put in your adventure, they're all fundamentally the same. They're just vehicles for presenting the players with difficult choices. And I remember this wonderful aha moment that one of the students had, because he was like, well, what can I use these hard choices for? You've laid them out, you've explained them to me, but I'm having a hard time coming up with opportunities to present the players with these hard choices. And I was like, how about a traps effect? And I remember I could just see, like, in the Discord chat, his mind just like, oh my God. And I even made a little list of like, hey, these are all the different kinds of challenges or hard choices that you can present the players on the back of a traps effect. And you can also make those riders of monster abilities and hazard abilities and curses and diseases. And that was sort of just like a moment that I had as well, where they're all fundamentally the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. Because that one of the questions that we got too on Twitter was about what can traps do other than hurt people? And I think those are great examples of things that traps can do and present hard choices. I think often of the Saw movies, right? That people are in traps there and they often have to make some sort of very difficult choice in order to get out of the trap. You know, there can be inspiration drawn kind of all over the place with these things.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ways, because I am who I am. I'm working on a video game with a friend of mine where the character is immortal, so she can't really die. And so we had to sit down. There's a Google Doc somewhere. Someone has looked at it. Google's seen it. They know I wrote it. That's just a list, and it's just called "How to Threaten Somebody Without Killing Them." And I probably should have put some more context in that doc, because it's just like that. But there's a lot of ways that you can threaten or challenge the players without dealing damage or without killing them. And that was something that I had to spend a lot of time with, the Testament of Malice, because I couldn't just put a book together that was 100 pages of it hits you when you die. Right. So I had to really think hard. It's like, okay, in the classic sort of D&D style dungeon crawl, what are the ways that I can threaten players? What are resources they have? So one of my favorites is geared towards folks who are doing a bit more of like an old school, like a mega dungeon that has rumors, right? And rumors are one of my favorite things to use in my own dungeons. When I see them in published modules or things like Barrow Maze, I get really excited. And I was like, well, that could be a vector for threatening the players. So there's actually a trap in the book, and it's a little bit of a narrative stretch, but I love doing that kind of stuff, where if you trigger the trap, this volcano erupts. And that volcano destroys a city of scribes and burns their libraries to ash, which means the players can no longer get any rumors, because that's where all of the old maps and scrolls were, right? Again, it's kind of a narrative stretch, but there's a lot of things like, gold, or the ability to heal, right? Or the making perception checks. So one of the traps in the book, if the players try to do something in the game system, it's a system neutral book, but if they're trying to do something in the game system that is intended to reveal new knowledge, maybe a divination spell or a perception check or discern realities you're playing Dungeon World, there's an effect where if that fails, something bad, I think it's summon skeletons to like start punching you in the gut or something like that. Things like doors, right? Players take for granted the ability to open doors, especially doors they've already unlocked. So one of the traps is, okay, all the doors slam shut. And every single time you open up a door, that's a level of energy drain. Just, stuff like that. Just thinking about all the different ways that you can make the players' lives harder and threaten the resources, both tangible and intangible, that they rely on to be successful, that aren't just like hit points and armor class.
I would love to see that document. That is a great sort of way of thinking too about how do we threaten players without death, because I think sometimes, especially in high magic D&D games, high level D&D games, it's like, well, we've all got our diamonds on us, and the cleric will be ready to cast resurrection if you're reduced to a pile of ash or that sort of thing. So it's always great to think about things beyond that realm, to give some more meaning to everything that's going on, and also torturing your players is fun, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that it's really important to not do is shut the players down. That's always something that things like ability drain were always a challenge for me, because that often resulted in that sort of like positive feedback loop death spiral where things are just getting worse and worse for you. Because, well, my primary ability is like -6 now, so I can't really participate. And now in battles, I'm getting wrecked up. So one of the little tricks that I like to use is, rather than diminishing the player's chance of success, keep those odds mostly the same, but make failure much, much worse. Or present a hard choice. So one of the things that I like to do in my own games is, okay, you got some kind of curse. I'm not going to reduce or impose disadvantage or something like that. But every time you want to use this ability, you're going to have to make a hard choice. Or if you fail with this ability, the consequences are going to be a lot more, they're going to be a lot rougher for you, right?
Right.
Because it's just not very fun to not be able to fully participate in the game. And that's something that I thought about a lot with Testament of Malice, is trying to make sure that there was nothing in the book that would force a player to sit out and not participate in the fun. That's like a complete failure of game design in my mind.
And I think I hear that complaint a lot about traps and about sort of save or suck abilities, that people have deemed them. And that's a great way around it, is to add more risk as things are going, as opposed to just making things worse and worse, sort of unilaterally across the board. As when your examples of dangers in the dungeon becoming more dangerous, right? Becoming more threatening. Yeah. Does that lead to then, by the time you're at that final trap, things are really crazy with that trap if you've, set off a bunch of other traps before you get to it?
Yeah, sometimes.
That's awesome.
and yeah. I mean, depending on what your goal is for your game. So like my stuff is typically either a one shot or a very limited run campaign where there are clear winning and losing conditions. So it is certainly possible for the players to do so poorly and trigger so many traps that make things so much harder for them without killing them, that when they get to sort of the final confrontation, they're at an incredible disadvantage and will probably die. But kind of making things harder for the players is something that you can modulate if you want to have something that's more difficult or less difficult. So there's definitely no reason why you could have a trap that doesn't necessarily make the dungeon like mechanically more difficult, right? Or drain their resources, but it could be narratively more difficult. So one of the very last traps in the book, it doesn't deal any damage. It doesn't take any resources from the players or damage their equipment or steal their spells. But what it does is it forces them to name an ally that they've made over the course of the campaign. And what happens is that ally, their succubus, reveals herself in that organization that the powerful ally is a part of, and assassinates that ally.
Whoa.
and takes control of that organization. And the way it's written in the book, again, it's not, it's nothing mechanical. It's not necessarily making their dungeon delve more difficult, but it says this formerly allied organization now becomes a hostile organization, and it is looking for the player characters when they go back to town to role play. So again, like there's a lot of ways that you can, if you're, not so much into the more crunchy, turn by turn dungeon crawl stuff, and you're more into sort of dramatic turns and larger kind of overarching narratives. It's like when we talked about sort of the Death Trap dungeon stuff, long ago on this very podcast. You can definitely harm the players narratively without harming them physically.
Hey everyone, we're going to take a quick break and then back to the babble. Hey everybody, just wanted to take a quick break to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by D&D Beyond. D&D Beyond is the official digital toolset and game companion for Dungeons & Dragons. You can use D&D Beyond to build characters, track campaigns, run adventures, and do so much more. D&D Beyond has a lot of awesome content for free, like the D&D basic rules, articles from awesome writers like James J. Hake, and incredible video interviews from Todd Kenrick. Plus, you get an awesome actual play each week in Heroes of the Veil. There's so much going on over at D&D Beyond. You have to go check them out. It has made my play experience better. There's almost always some sort of sale going on. They've got lots of great content. Go check them out. dndbeyond.com. Let's get back to the babble. So let's talk a little bit about running traps too, right? You have a trap. I think one of the things that DMs get tripped up with, right, is like, am I running this trap fair? Is this, did I pull a gotcha and I didn't give the players a chance to respond? That sort of thing, especially when you're dealing with a trap that could have like a big important consequence like that. So how do you run traps in your games? If you have like examples you want to go from, we can even go from there and sort of work backwards or whatever you want to do. But like, what's good advice for people who, maybe they pick up Testament of Malice and they're like, awesome, I want to run this trap. How can they run it effectively?
Yeah, so I think it helps that those three sort of placement options are laid out like at the very beginning. It's like page 2 or something like that. And I think that really helps. A lot of the gotcha traps are traps that are placed somewhere where the players aren't necessarily expecting them, like a very nondescript hallway or a nondescript door, right? I feel like those three placement opportunities are like dramatically, they're interesting and they seem to make sense. One of the principles that I use when designing things is that a trap's overall threat level and the extent to which it can really wreck up the players should be inversely proportional, maybe that's the right one, on how difficult it is to unearth. So basically, like the less you telegraph a trap, in my mind, the trap should be less dangerous, right? So I'm a little bit okay with the trap that, maybe doesn't affect the players that negatively being a little bit more of a surprise.
Right.
It should never be totally undetectable. Every challenge in your game should be telegraphed in some way, but how subtle you make those telegraphs and sort of the leaps in logic and the leaps in inference or the resources that you should ask players to sacrifice to get those telegraphs. I think the harder, the more dangerous, the more punishing the trap, the more it should be telegraphed, right? And there's a lot of different ways. And of course, the game system that you're playing in can help with that. So of course, D&D has stuff like perception. Dungeon World has things like discern realities and trap expert. I always like to try to introduce ways where traps can be sort of unearthed or learned about in ways outside of rolling. I actually don't find the system I play at home doesn't have anything like perception. There's no way to just roll and see a thing or learn a thing. But if it's a trap, it's like, yeah, this could really screw the players up. I try to introduce multiple different ways for them to learn about its existence. Now, that all being said, one of the major trap types that I laid out earlier, it's visible to the players, right? Many traps aren't hidden or don't need to be hidden. So in many ways, they function more like hazards or in some cases monsters if they can, have a bunch of different actions or move around. So, putting a dart swarm or a fissure at a choke point in a battle, or like the one I mentioned earlier, the second the players walked in the room, they saw this Atlas statue with the giant sphere of magma on its back. And even though it didn't move or outwardly signal it was going to do anything, immediately every player was like, that's going to be trouble. Like, I do not like the look to that. And then, of course, with things like Punisher traps, that they're placed to essentially be a demotivator for the players and try like a bunch of different solutions to a puzzle. And of course, it's always set up in such a way where even if the players don't know what the specific trap is, like I said, you walk into a room and you look and you're like, oh God, here we go. Like there's gonna be, we know there's a puzzle to solve here, and we know that we're not just gonna get infinite retries. Like something's gonna happen if I put the wrong skull on the wrong pedestal or light the wrong torch or speak the wrong incantation, that kind of thing. One last thing I'll say on that is that I really encourage folks to create traps that are still interesting, even if they get found by the players, right? So again, depending on the system you're in, like it might be pretty short order between discovering a hidden trap and disabling it.
Sure.
But if you have that are a bit more resilient to being disabled, or I like to pair traps up as part of a battle. So as the players don't have like unlimited time, it's like, well, I have to make a choice here. Do I attack? Do I move into a position of safety? Or do I spend an action trying to tinker with this trap to disable it? And maybe it's not a simple matter of, poking it with thieves' tools or casting the spell magic. Maybe there's more to it. But yeah, I always try to talk myself through a scenario of, okay, what happens if they find this trap? Can it still be interesting? And I think pit traps are a great example. Like, yeah, typically they're hidden. And if they're found, that can make the players' lives easier, unless that pit is at a choke point, right? Where there's not a really easy way to get around it. It's still presenting the players with sort of a complication to their tactic.
That is definitely true, that if you can have something that it's not just like, well, we found it, now we'll make a thieves' tools check and we're disabled and we're moving on. It's a much more interesting trap, especially if, I love that pit trap example because it's so simple and yet it's so effective, right? Well-placed pit trap can be a very interesting tool, and it's one of those tools that you were saying earlier, like, can reward clever players too, right?
I mean, as weird as it might sound to say, like in my own home games, like there's like no real discussion around searching for traps. Like as weird as that sounds, like that's just not something that really comes up, in large part because of that placement strategy that I use, right? Like there's never, and I think that might lead into another question a lot of people have is, how do I use traps in a game without slowing the whole thing to a goddamn crawl? You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in large part, it's priming the players to understand that it's like, I'm not going to put a trap in this really dramatically uninteresting place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like that goes back to your whole gotcha thing. Like, if you're struck with a trap and there was no telegraphing or no sense of like, this is a dangerous place, I don't see a trap right now, but I'm pretty sure there is one, or we've seen this trap the whole time and it's in like this tactical choke point in this battle. Like you can either tell the players straight up, like I did with my groups, like, hey, like these are the situations in which you're going to encounter traps. Or if you want to take a bit more of like a subtle approach, you run a game with that strategy. Players are really good at sort of seeing beyond the trappings of a game to the underlying system. So actually, I just not too long ago read this book called The Theory of Fun by Rafe Koster. And yeah, it's really good. And he has a whole chapter about just how good human beings are when they're playing games to sort of see the underlying systems and then game the hell out of it and try to optimize for it. So in a lot of cases, if a GM isn't 100% comfortable just saying, hey, in this campaign or this adventure, like these, are the situations in which you are likely to encounter traps, if they want to, have a more, I don't know what you call it, simulationist or immersive sort of approach, mm-hmm. The players will very quickly abandon poking every single spot with a 10-foot pole when they realize that it doesn't really buy them anything, that it's not really helping them. And then, of course, that question can be very game system specific. So one of the things I like about Dungeon World that sort of really drew me into it was that every single roll puts the players at risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so, compared to something, like traditional D&D, where it's like I have a perception skill and I can roll it to look around, but if I don't see anything new, nothing bad happens to me for the most part, right? But as written in a game like Dungeon World, if you roll Discern Realities or Trap Expert or something and you fail, something bad happens to you. And maybe it's a trap, but maybe the GM will bring to bear sort of one of her other moves. You know what I mean? So that's something to keep in mind. Like if the system that you're running allows the players essentially like free, unlimited perception check breadsticks, think about modifying that or having a conversation with the players and saying like, hey, I want this game to feel a bit more perilous. So I'm going to take a page out of, like Dungeon World's book and say like a failed perception check will result, or every roll puts you at risk.
It's so fascinating, right, to be talking about traps, which I think people consider very crunchy, and Dungeon World, which I think people consider not very crunchy, going together hand in hand like this.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the big thing is just, even in stuff like OD&D, mm-hmm. right, where there wasn't stuff like perception. No. And that trope of, that's where the 10-foot pole trope comes from. But it's interesting because there was a cost, and there was a cost in time.
Right.
And if you played those games straight, and I think even through like second edition, it was still a pretty significant part of the game system. Like, yeah, you can poke and prod every 10-foot square with a pole, but every time you do that, that eats a turn, and that eats up your light, that eats up your rations, and that risks wandering monster rolls, right? So I think that, again, even D&D in its history recognized that in order to make sort of the hidden traps threatening, there needed to be some sort of cost involved in finding those traps. There needs to be some hard choice. Like, do I suspect that there's a trap here enough that I want to burn, one turn of torch or one turn of rations or a potential wandering monster roll to look in this spot? Because otherwise, if you get rid of that disincentive, it's just tap all the way down, and that's not very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I think people talk about Death Trap Dungeons, the Tomb of Horrors comes up a lot, right? But that was a timed competition module when it was created. So not only did you have to worry about your time in the dungeon, you had to worry about real world time because you would, if you didn't finish the dungeon, you weren't going to win this competitive module. Some of the later modules have sort of story reasons built in, right? Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan has like this, hey, if you're not out of this dungeon in 2 hours, you're going to suffocate because there's a low level of poison gas in here, and you're about to run out of oxygen if you don't get out of here fast enough. So I think that is something to keep in mind is, the costs of taking time and what are those is always something that I think should be kept in mind with traps. Because, yeah, if you can be super careful, then why have a trap at all, right? Unlimited food, unlimited resources. Why are you playing D&D too? Would be my question.
Yeah. Well, and again, that all being said, I run kind of a little homebrew thing and I have been for about, 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. And there are no thief archetypes. There's no perception. There's actually no knowledge skills. It's pretty minimal. And I have not missed any of that at all. And I've not had an issue running death trap stuff. Because again, I think, I'm very explicit, but even if I weren't, the players would pick up really quickly on, it's just not to our advantage to just tap every brick and do that. Like, we know that there's going to be, traps as part of a battle or as part of a twist or to punish us for this very obvious sort of meta puzzle that the GM has put in front of us. Like, I've not had a single problem with it.
Are you going to put out that system for consumption at some point?
No.
But
I have posted, I do have a little one-page quick start sheet.
Oh, cool.
And these little pre-gens I made. It's called Faith and Fire. I've shared those on Twitter, but I'm happy to throw those your way in case someone wants to look at it and see if they can reverse engineer it.
So we've talked like a ton about traps and how to make them and how to run them and stuff. As we're wrapping up here, do you have any favorites that we haven't talked about yet from Testament of Malice that you want to call out?
Oh my God. So one of the things that was really fun about coming up with the traps in the book is the sources of inspiration for some of the traps. And there's a trap in the book, one of my favorites, called Vaporizers Faithful. And the gist of it is it's kind of like this magic railgun turret. What it does is it fires at you, but it fires so quickly that you don't have the traditional option to sort of like make a save to dodge out of the way. So your options are take the hit, or you can risk grabbing something shiny like your shield or your breastplate and try to redirect the beam. But it's not just like a simple redirect. I think that the word in the book is like an improbable series of redirects throughout the dungeon. So it's like you name a monster or an object in the room you're in, and then a metallic or reflective object on the dungeon level that you're on, and then an object that's metallic anywhere else in the mega dungeon. And then you roll, and so like any monsters that are hit or vaporized, any doors or chests or objects that are hit are busted open, right? But if you fail that risk, you're vaporized. You're done. You can't even get regenerated. And the inspiration for that trap came from that scene in Wayne's World. Where, you know where I'm going with this? That was 1992 or 93, where they have to figure out how to convince Frankie Sharp of Sharp Records to see Cassandra's band so she gets the record deal. And Garth has this idea where he's like, I can bounce the satellite signal off the Azores, give it back to SATCOM by a transponder 137, and back to the dish in Mr. Big's limo. And I was watching that, and I'm like, that's the trap. That's the trap right there. Well, there was a lot of stuff like that, like a lot of just trying to find inspiration for traps and interesting interactions and things like that.
That's awesome. And I love that scene in Wayne's World, and I love that there's trap inspiration coming from there. You can really draw it from anywhere, it just goes to show. So is there anything else we should mention about traps? I mean, we could probably go on for another 3 hours, so I hope that you'll come back to keep talking traps with me. But is there anything else we should mention for this podcast before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that it's okay for traps to not be right for your game. In my mind, I feel like a lot of the issues around traps have to do with the fact that honestly, throughout the game's entire lifetime, they've just been, not very well realized. Like, one of the thoughts I had was like, why is it that when I pick up like a new set of core books for D&D, or even like a D&D like game like Dungeon World, there's a whole section just dedicated to all the different monsters, and really sort of doing a lot of work to help the GM understand what monsters are about and how to use them well. And then even in sort of contemporary games with 40, 50 years of knowledge behind us, it's like, oh, well, traps can be a dart and a saving throw. Maybe if you're bold, you can do like an encounter trap that goes on initiative, but there really isn't a whole lot of good examples. And then there's things like Grimtooth, which I'm sure there's all kinds of people who are waiting for me to mention that. I don't enjoy the Grimtooth books at all. That's just a personal preference. And I think in my perspective, they illustrate what I think is a problem with traps. And, I say that knowing the book was probably meant to be more humorous than useful at the table. I don't know. But when I was reading through it, it was a lot of contraption. And that was something that I was really like trying to avoid with Testament of Malice. That there's no contraption, there's no Rube Goldberg stuff. There's really not even really any contrivances, right? Sure. And that was the thing where it's like, okay, cool. There's this kind of humorous sort of Rube Goldberg like intro to a Pee Wee Herman movie going on for the GM, right? But again, it comes back to the interaction. In a lot of cases, it was the player makes a saving throw, and if they fail, they take some amount of damage or some amount of ability drain. And for me, that's just not terribly interesting. But even those aside, I just don't think there's a whole lot of good examples of traps. And so I get why people don't like them. I invite folks to sort of play around, and I'll be sure to send all of sort of my notes to you, James. You can feel free to link to those in the show notes. But again, that all being said, it's totally okay for someone to say, you know what, just in the kind of game I'm trying to run, or the systems that I'm playing with, or the people that I'm playing with, even with all this hopefully helpful advice, I just don't really see a place for them in my game, and that's totally okay.
Sure, but hopefully after this podcast and listening to you and maybe checking out Testament of Malice, people are eager to give it a shot.
No, it's free too, so there's absolutely no risk.
Yes, exactly. It's totally free, and people should definitely check it out. It's a great book. I love the way the traps are, divided up and everything, and I love the art is really cool for it too. Also, the fact that this is free, like this is a lot of pages you got going on here. This isn't just a few traps. This is many traps that we have going on.
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to do a monster manual of traps. I know it's not like a new idea, but it's not something I see a lot. And to give an indication to how long I've been working on it, Felicia Kano, who did the color illustrations for the book, for that very first one where the sister of Malice is running down the hallway, you'll see that her watermark on that, if you look closely, is 2012. So that's how long this book has been in my mind.
Wow. Holy crap. That's incredible. I think we should mention too, like, it works not just with D&D. It is a system neutral trap book that people can use.
Which in my mind, it helps because I actually don't play a whole lot of D&D itself on my own, but also it allowed me to not worry about the mechanics and not get that tunnel vision of things like saving throws and ability scores. And so it kind of forced me, okay, focus on the interactions, focus on what's interesting, focus on the choices, because I can't fall back on a stat block. You know what I mean? Yes. To sort of carry the product. It has to be, there's no stats here. I can't lean in any numbers. I can't lean in any mechanics of the game. It's just, here's the most like raw, interesting things that I can come up with.
It shows there are just really, really great things in here. So Vorpal Limb Splitter, come on, people. You got to check this out.
Yeah, the titles, that was at the risk of talking too much, like that was one of the things that was really important to me. Mm-hmm. And I actually went through about a week before the release when I had laid out the table of contents, and I showed it to Aaron, who did the editing and the poetry for the book. And I was like, does this seem badass enough? Like if someone looked at just the table of contents, mm-hmm. would they be like really terrified? And hopefully the answer to that question for a lot of people is yes. So yeah, the names were the hardest part, and they were the most fun.
Yeah, I mean, this is, some of it's so poetic. Tears of the Hate Blossom, like there's some stuff, Ashes of the Judged, that people are definitely going to feel like, oh my God, is this the greatest metal album of all time?
It absolutely is.
Yeah, for sure. So, well, Sersa, thanks so much for coming on. Where can people find you, man?
Yeah, so I'm at sersavictory.com. That's where you can see what I'm working on. When my things are released, I'll pop them up. And on the homepage, I have all of the Tabletop Babble episodes that I've been on, so people can go check out some of those episodes as well.
Awesome. And we're going to link all of that over at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com for people to check out. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on again. It's always a blast.
That was a great interview with Sersa. You know, people, if you want to support the show financially, you can head on over to patreon.com/Introcaso. That's patreon.com/Introcaso, where you can go ahead and for $1 a month, you get to help decide the direction of this podcast. What topics are we going to cover? That sort of thing. The direction of my blog, worldbuilderblog.com. And what are we going to cover on the Patreon? What rewards are people going to be getting? All that and so much more. You can leave me feedback there. It's over at patreon.com/Introcaso. Go check it out. If you can't leave us any money, but you still want to help support the show, head on over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star review. I will read it out loud. You can make me say anything you want. Even if you're not using iTunes, odds are your podcatcher app uses the iTunes algorithms to rate and recommend podcasts. So go check it out. All right, people, you can find me on Twitter at James Introcaso. That's at JamesIntrocaso. Also, check out my blog, worldbuilderblog.com, which is all about my design work in games. What am I doing? What am I releasing? But also, you know, there's just free content there. So go check it out. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Don't forget, RPGs are like sex. Hey everybody, just wanted to remind you that this podcast was brought to you by D&D Beyond. Now, I talked about D&D Beyond earlier, but I really need to stress this. It's made my game better. It is so easy to build and carry characters around, and it has also made it easy on my new players. So anytime you buy content in dndbeyond.com, if you're of a specific subscription level, you can go ahead and share that content with your players. And I have a lot of stuff on there because I love using D&D Beyond. So I share it with my players, and it makes it easy. New players have everything in front of them. The player's handbook is there. They click on a spell, its description pops up. They don't need to go through a book, look through a stack of spell cards. It's all right there. They can access it from their tablet, their laptop, whatever. It is really, really great. I'm headed over to D&D in a castle as well. And right now, I have all my D&D books on an iPad. I don't have to lug pounds and pounds of books through the airport on my back, bending my spine. So go check it out, dndbeyond.com. You'll be happy you did.